right, so on this one we're going to talk about section 9.2, different types of error. There's a type 1 error and a type 2 error. Because there are two types of errors, there are actually 4 possible outcomes. So as we go through this, there are 4 possible outcomes, and this is probably the spot that makes the most sense. You can look at this table if you want to, but the decision not to reject the null when it is true. Okay, so the decision not to reject the null when it is true. That's a correct decision. Okay? To reject the null when the null was true. This incorrect decision is a type 1 error. Okay? And then not to reject the null when the null is false. Okay? That's a type 2 error. And then to reject the null when the null is false. That's a correct decision. So the 2 errors come when we make those incorrect decisions. So on this one, the type 1 error, when you reject the null when it is true. This would be saying, like, I think the example in the text gives when somebody thinks that rock climbing is really unsafe when in fact it is safe. Okay? When done correctly and use the right equipment, it's safe. Type 2 error is to not reject the null when in fact the null is false. Okay, so this would be like the hypothesis being something like if you say that the hypothesis that someone is well, like that they're healthy, and saying, okay, well, they're healthy, but it turns out you're saying, okay, we're going to not reject that hypothesis, but it turns out that they were really sick. Okay, that's a type 2 error. All right, so if we look at the try at 9.5 on page 506, this one says, suppose the null hypothesis, H sub O, is the blood cultures contain no traces of pathogen X. And it's asking us to state a type 1 error and a type 2 error. So the type 1 error is the error when the hypothesis is true, but we reject that hypothesis. Okay. So this would be saying where the null hypothesis is the blood culture contains no traces of pathogens, but we reject that hypothesis, even though and finding out that the hypothesis was true. So saying that the null was correct and then rejecting that. So in this case, that would be rejecting that, saying that there are traces of pathogen X. A type 2 error would be the type of error when we fail to reject the hypothesis and the hypothesis is false. Okay, so if our hypothesis is the blood cultures contain no traces of pathogen X, us saying that we fail to reject that hypothesis when we doubt that the hypothesis is wrong. Okay, so that saying that this is false, but we fail to reject it. Okay, now we're going to go through example 9.6. So this null hypothesis is the victim of an automobile accident is alive when he arrives in the emergency room of the hospital. A type 1 error would be that the emergency crew thinks that the victim is dead when in fact the victim is alive. So this is rejecting the hypothesis even when the hypothesis is correct. Okay? And the type 2 error would be the emergency crew does not know if the victim is alive when in fact the victim is dead. So that'd be saying that the hypothesis is incorrect, and then the failure to reject that hypothesis. All right, so let's talk about alpha and beta. Alpha is the probability of a type 1 error, okay, of that type of error being made. And beta is the probability of a type 2 error being made. We need these errors to be as small as possible. Okay, there's always a chance for those errors to happen, so they're not going to be 0, but they should be really small. We want them to be as small as possible. So if we come back to this example 9.6, alpha is the probability that the emergency crew thinks that the victim is dead when in fact the victim is alive. Okay, alpha is talking about that probability. Beta is the probability that the emergency crew doesn't know if the victim is alive when in fact the victim is dead. And you can look at these two different types of errors and know which one has the greater consequence. So the type 1 error is the error that the victim is dead when in fact the victim is alive. Okay? And then the one with the bigger error is type 1, because in this one, if the emergency crew thinks the victim is dead, they're not going to treat him. So if he's alive, but they think he's dead, that's going to have a greater consequence than type 2 error, when the emergency crew doesn't know the victim is alive when in fact the victim was dead. Alright, so if we go through the try it 9.6, suppose the null hypothesis is a patient is not sick. Which type of error has a greater consequence? A type 2. Alright, so we need to know which error is going to have the greater consequence. So we need to state what those errors would be. So for type 1 error, that means that the null is true. A patient is not sick. We're saying that's true, but we decide to reject that. So that would be saying, okay, the patient really isn't sick, but we're going to reject that he's not sick. Okay? Type 2 is the hypothesis is false, but the decision is to reject or fail to reject the hypothesis. So saying in this one that the patient is sick, because that means this is false. So the patient is sick, okay, but we fail to reject that hypothesis. So that if the patient is sick, but we fail to reject that, we're not going to treat him. So in this case, a type 2 error has greater consequence. Okay? Okay, we're going to take a look at the try it 9.8. So on this one, we're trying to identify which of these is the type 1 error and the type 2 error. Our hypothesis, the null hypothesis, is state that the percent of adults with jobs is at least 88%. Okay, so now I've got these over here written here. So we're going to divide these up into the two types of errors that they could be. So on this one, for a type 1 error, the decision has to be to reject the null. Of these, the only ones that reject the null are C and D. So these two could be type 1. Now on this one, for the type 2, it's failed to reject the null or not to reject the null. That means that these two have the possibility of being the type 2. I'm not saying that they are, but just by looking at the first parts, these could fit a type 2, possibly, and these could fit a type 1, possibly. Alright, so now looking back at our hypothesis, that's saying that the percentage of adults with jobs is at least 88%. That's greater than or equal to 88%. Alright, so now we're going to take a look. Let's decide which one is our type 1 error. So we've already simplified this down to say that it's got to be C or D, because the decision was to reject the null hypothesis. Now we just need to see which one says that that hypothesis was true. So on this one, the percentage of adults with jobs is at least 88%, when the percentage is actually at least 88%. Okay. And this one says the percentage of adults who have jobs is at least 88% when that percentage is actually less. This is when it's saying that it's false, but in order to be a type 1 error, the null hypothesis has to be true. So this, part C, is actually the type 1 error. And we're going to do the same thing for the type 2 error. But on this one, we need the null to be false. Okay, so we read part A, says that the percentage of adults who have jobs is at least 88% when that percentage is actually less than 88%. Okay, that's saying that that hypothesis was false, because this other one for part B says that it's at least 88% when it actually at least 88%. That would say that that hypothesis is true. So we want the one where the hypothesis is false. So part A is the type 2 error.